Welcome everyone to our workshop. This is Toshi Matsunaga, my co-author. Let me explain the book and actually introduce Toshi so you can hear him say hi and see his face in case you can't. Toshi is my co-author for my eighth book, Awake But Sick, The Myth of Immediate Freedom and the Dangers of Spiritual Seeking and Finding. Hey Toshi, can you say hi?
Hello, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Yeah.
Toshi and I were just talking about how, well, we're both musicians, and that's kind of how we see this is like there's this riff that we're going to jam on together. There's this theme. This is a workshop series that we've called The Exact Nature of Avoidance. We made it different than the title of the book because the book focuses on that whole line of thinking called spiritual bypassing in a sense. And it's a book in that vein. And but yet it's so applicable to everything because when we're in a spiritual bypass, we're just doing what humans do every day. We're avoiding emotions that we've buried. And so we didn't want to limit that for you guys who might be coming in to do the work and you don't think in terms of spiritual seeking and finding. And even though we're going to
Mm.
talk about that, I think you're going to find, in other words, if you have any avoidance in your life, this is probably going to help you because we're going to talk about the exact nature of avoidance. And this segment is about seeking, spiritual seeking, but if we could say it's really broad, so it would be, I mean, what is spiritual seeking? There are a number of people who are on a spiritual path to enlightenment or healing, embodiment, happiness. I mean, if you get really broad, it's every human looking for something who feels like something is missing. But here we're going to talk about, for this segment, mostly seeking non-dual recognition. I think Toshi would agree we want to go for talking about the whole realization here and how we bypass that quite naturally just because we're programmed to avoid. So to get this started, I want to pull up a graphic that I think will help all of us to get a good basic understanding of what's in the book. So this is kind of a lecture series that takes a few topics in the book and really shows you the detail that you can't see in the book because you're here listening to us and we can show you things. So this is an iceberg graphic that you will find in the book if you read it. And it shows a lot about what we call the main duality. So we're talking about non-dual realization or transformation. We obviously want to be aware of duality and what non-duality is even pointing to. The issue, though, that what we found through this work and through bypassing for so many years is that, in our words, the main duality is often missed, not just in a spiritual path, but in a healing path, because this main duality is really responsible for all the suffering that we see, or a lot of it. Can't say all of it, but a lot of it comes from this main duality that we miss. So if I were to express the main duality very simply, it's that certain things are so unsafe that they don't arise and they're stored, repressed. And things that are safer than that will arise. It's really about fear, as you'll see. And as you see on the graphic, we have the word frozen fear there to help you see that we're really talking about fear here. And that's really all that we work with here in KI is fear. But these are specific fears that we have to hold in the body. It's like we couldn't feel certain emotions when we were kids. So over time, by not feeling those emotions and the fear of those are frozen. And it just feels like our body, our separate body. So this is why it's so relevant to non-duality, because the feeling of separation and the density of contractions often comes from, or really is, the frozen fear of what we call emotional repression. And then I'm going to zoom in a little bit, but just to understand the simplicity of the main duality is that these emotions, whatever they are, we'll talk about them, are buried. They don't arise. That's the thing to remember. Buried emotions do not arise to awareness. In fact, it's actually difficult to feel or express or make a buried emotion arise. And so they remain buried throughout our lives, and we are then avoiding those emotions. So we're going to talk about the pleasure pain cycle that we talked about in the book. And it's really as simple as understanding that in seeking pleasure, we avoid pain. And that creates this cycle, conditions us to keep doing it. Well, how that applies to seeking or spiritual bypassing or avoidance is whatever we do in our lives to stay safe from buried emotions, from whatever's under the water, tends to perpetuate itself, or we stay identified, or we keep seeking. See, if the seeking is driven by something under the water that we're not aware of, then it might just continue because, for example, it keeps us safe from the emotions that are buried. And it might continue to get us love and approval because if we keep seeking, we keep suffering, we keep the separation alive. And even though we might say we want to see through the self and have a non-dual realization, because we have repressed emotions, the seeking can keep going to keep us safe from those repressed emotions. So I'm going to ask Toshi if you want to comment on just a general, as we're just describing generally the iceberg and how it relates to seeking before we drill down on anything, Toshi.
Yeah, I guess seeking, I just want to explain how seeking moves as well. Like, feels like I have always been seeking, but it's like it just moves on to different things. It's about, again, we've talked about avoidance. It's like how creative can I get to avoid something so that I don't have to feel my buried emotions. So it's yeah, it when I was growing up, I was seeking to start it with maybe seeking to be loved and seeking to be held or to be seen by my mom and all of that. Moved on to making friends, being seen from others. So that I start playing music and start, doing all this stuff, and then, but then but the pain, the fear carries on, the fraud fear carry on. So I will have to keep managing that by being really creative with my avoidance, So I would use on my consumed myself with, making friends or doing drugs or all sorts of things as you're growing up, to numb this. And then obviously on top of that, there's these relations that happen, the bullying might happen or the heartbreaks between relationships will happen. And it's just like amongst that, you're seeking all the time, navigating to try and grab much as you can. And it's a very innocent movement. And I want to stress that yes, we call spiritual bypass this and spiritual bypass that and seeking is this. It's something we had to do, and it's not an enemy. It's not something that is necessary, but it's something we had to do to cope. And I want people to kind of really feel that when you start the work or when you start to read the book, because yes, it causes suffering, but without suffering, we would never know what we're doing. So that's that. So yeah, but coming back to the seeking move, so that yeah, all my life I've always seeked, and yeah, from music, playing music to making friends to coping with bullying to suffering, coping from the world, basically everything that was happening. So I would just keep moving. But then the reason why I stressed on spirituality and non-duality is because it was the most creative and most effective avoidance that I could come up with. I feel like I went through the world looking for the best way. I didn't know this at the time, of course, but repression's always looking for this. And what's the best way to avoid everything in one go? You could almost say it was spirituality and non-duality, where I could really tune into, because I won't go into too much to it, but it is the truth to a point. I want everyone to find this through their experience and stuff like that, because if you just hear it from me or Scott, it will be a concept and it will be an idea or thoughts. But the idea is like there's nobody here, everything's empty, and there's just us, there's just oneness and all of that. They're great and they have a truth to them. So there's almost like a license to keep them there and keep using that. So that really helps me to kind of hold on to and use it, avoid compared to um I don't know, being addicted to something or getting love from, playing music or being having friends and stuff like that. That doesn't have that consistency on all of these things. But spirituality and non-duality is like, wow, like, there's nobody here to suffer. There's nobody actually feeling anything, Toshi. It's like, oh wow, yes, that's like, it's just that it ticked, I've spoken about this before, but it ticked a huge box for me to avoid everything in one go. And the landing was so strong that I just couldn't see it. And then yeah, so I could drop all of my addictions, avoidance style, attachment styles, all those needs, put it into one basket called non-duality. Because all my pain went, all my addiction for getting high, and then, people's approval, all of that dropped away when I really moved into spirituality. Especially I had these awakening experiences and stuff like that. That just reinforced everything. It's like, wow, it's amazing. And when you feel pleasure, it's like that reinforces everything, and then obviously the pain will follow. But at that period, it's just pleasure. So I just want to talk about how, yes, we concentrate on talking about spirituality in the book, but the seeking, we always have to seek because we have to avoid, just like we said. So, yeah, I hand
Yeah.
you back here. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's great because I mean, we can focus in on any of these things now, but I was just pulling this up as he was talking because as you go deeper into our work, KI, you actually see that KI is simple because it's focusing on something that's much simpler than what appears at the tip. It's just two core fears. And as Toshi was going through what he was saying, creative, he had to be creative with his avoidance. This is why I pulled this up because we're even more creative than this. We had to reduce these categories just to fit them on the tip. But like this is
Yeah.
our suffering here at the tip. And and so we don't even want to vilify it here. I mean, we do, of course, because it's our suffering, but the framework here is not to vilify either our suffering or our attempts to alleviate it. It's to have a better look at, have insight to see where it's coming from. So what I wanted to focus on here is just the simple concept that Toshi was beginning to expound upon, which is how creative we have to be. So if you guys can understand that in this path, our creativity, when he says creativity, it's like he kept saying move. That's what we do. It's like we're looking for something and we have to keep changing it up because we can't really go deep anywhere. I see a lot of people, for example, they'll pick up something, but they don't know how to go deep within that to get the full benefit. And that constantly moving and seeking, if you can understand, is driven by fear. The compulsive nature of it is really driven by these fears associated with feeling and expressing emotion. I mean, authenticity, our true authenticity. It's these simple fears that create this very creative avoidance strategy or strategies throughout life, which is really all of our suffering that comes from repression. But what we're focusing on here today is just basically these teachings and practices that do not reach emotional repression. I'll just focusing on that. But remembering that this is still our pleasure. So when we're doing a practice or involved in a teaching that contains a bypass, even though our suffering is likely to continue in some way, it's still our pleasure because it keeps us safe from the buried emotions. So we're going to talk in a different segment about finding or self-realization and how that can have its traps and pitfalls. But today we're talking about the teachings and practices, excuse me, that do not reach emotional repression. And I'll just come back to Toshi. Keep that in your mind as you listen to us. Teachings and practices that don't reach repression. So I'd like to start Toshi with where, like, as mentors here, we actually draw a line, a boundary. And I think about repression, how you find your authenticity, you can express your boundaries. And just as a teacher, being able to express a boundary that this particular practice or inquiry doesn't reach the buried emotions. I've discovered it, and this one does. And I can say that to people, and they of course don't have to listen because everybody has the right to do what they want. But being able to say that makes me more confident doing this topic because I wanted to give this up for a while because there's so much bypassing. I wanted to ask you about that because I know you're razor sharp about that in terms of things that do and do not reach repression. Is there anything you want to say about the practices in first dimension? Let's start there about how they don't reach repression for people who haven't read the book yet, and maybe even define what first dimension is for people
Yeah,
first.
sure. Yeah, so first dimension is how I see it in simple terms. It's what's here without you prompting anything. You're not using any tools of inquiry to ask anything unconscious, like what is on the surface in everyday life. So example would be chronic pain, addiction, shadows, triggers, chronic thinking, all of those stuff, you know. And there is this, and then you can talk about it in terms of practices as well, where first dimension practices is you just sit in awareness or just allowing things to come up and just as it is, you know. But we've talked about how things are not coming up. But from this point of view, first dimension, this is where, you know, you just sit and observe. And I guess, you know, it basically it was helpful for me to be able to see that I am not thoughts, I am not this, I am not that, all of that. But you must not stop there. And this is the thing. So this is the, you know, the teaching that does not get the emotional repression and can be a bypass. This is a classic example, you see, because you could sit with it. And if you, I've never really sat with myself ever, really, all my life. I was busy seeking, as you say. But now seeking is like different way. I'm about sitting and avoiding, which I didn't see. So yeah, just being with things that is rising was refreshing. It's really good to see that, and it's an entry point to KI to a point as well. But this, but people get stuck here, and this is the problem because it's quite soothing. Because I start, even I had my, yes, before my awakening experience and after, awareness was, or the place I was sitting called awareness or whatever it is. Awareness is here, whether you think about it or not, it doesn't matter, it's always here. But I will start to naturally create this place that will suit me or to make me rest in it or something like that. And it gives me pleasure. And this is a pleasure principle cycle. Every time I get my needs met, meaning every time I became creative to avoid my emotions, I get a bonus. I get a sweet, I get a treat, which is a pleasure. I didn't notice at the time, but when you know, when you get this, you know, it feels right. It's like, oh my God, you know, yes, it's awareness. Every, you know, there's nothing here and there's nobody here and all those things. And you, actually, your nervous system calms down because the fear drops, you see, because remember, repression is constantly running. I'm always scared. You know, it's very subtle, but that fear feels like Toshi, so it's hard to know. Or it's not like, oh, I'm scared because someone's gonna hurt me or something. No, it's just a natural state. But because I've been repressed, I had to repress my anger all the time. All I'm feeling is fear all the time, most of the time. So when that goes away, it's like, ah, you know, I get my pleasure, and then the pain, the fear will come back again. So it's easy to be stuck there when you start to get something out of something in first dimension by sitting in with what's already here. But what's already here is the result of my creativity or pushing everything down so nothing can ever come up. So I'm just sitting here, like using so much energy to keep everything down, really not knowing I could speak like this. So, and then every time I do that successfully, I get, ah, yeah, awareness, you know, just, you know, sitting there, resting it, abiding it, feels great. That's when it's not just happening, whether you feel good or not, it doesn't matter. But anyway, I won't go into that. So that's first dimension kind of
Yeah.
definition, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I wanted to bring the map up while Toshi was talking, and you can say more in a second, Toshi, because some people haven't seen this map. And Toshi and I, Toshi actually created the map. We conceptualize it to help people understand these dimensions, and it seems really important. Just talk about seeking is he's
Mhm.
talking about first dimension. But before we do that, let me kind of explain the map. The red lines represent the frozen fear under the water. It's conceptual, but this is in your experience. There's fear hidden in your body and it's frozen. And so basically it affects everything that you're doing. It's driving you. So when you're in first dimension practices, the frozen fear is affecting directly what's going on. And that's what Toshi was saying. But you have no consciousness, no awareness of the frozen fear, which contains the buried emotions. So all you have awareness of is what what arises to awareness, and that's what brings the dimension practice talk. So the first dimension, as Toshi said, is where you're resting or being, meditating, but nothing is being propped up that wouldn't otherwise arise. So you wouldn't go into the body and prompt something up in first dimension. Just rest, let things be, come back to awareness, mindfulness. And then we'll talk about second dimension in a second. I wanted to come back to you, Toshi, because you mentioned something about, if I can just pull this up so people can see, you mentioned something that, like, when we're sitting in awareness, we're holding back, well, what I would call our life force, but you used a different word. And yet that's really unconscious, and that's that frozen fear. Would you agree? And then Can you express to people so they don't know? Because I got the image when you were talking of like when we're on a meditation mat and something kind of comes up and goes, it can feel very peaceful and expansive. And then people do not know that at the unconscious level is this holding back or holding in. Can you describe that experience a little bit more now that I have the map up so people can see some things?
Yeah, I didn't notice at the time, but it was I start to create a location when there's no way an awareness is location basically, and I've experienced that too. But the subtlety of that movement to avoid buried emotion is so subtle, and so I was so good at it basically, keeping my anger down. So I would naturally start to create a state or a location or somewhere I can rest in. So whenever uncomfortable feeling comes up, oh, I'm gonna rest in awareness. I must remember there's nobody here. And those thoughts it will come and they will feel so true. And as soon as I believe that, it's all about identification basically. It will come down to that. So yeah, and then the soothing will be here because the fear level drops. But it was about yeah, keeping everything down. I always sit on the mat or meditation mat or whatever when I just rest in awareness. It's it feels I don't know, it's amazing. At the time, yes, it felt amazing, but also the suffering will always come afterwards. And I didn't know how much energy I was using to push everything down, making sure how much I had energy I had to use to keep everything down. And it sounds crazy, but I had commands because you can't just not keep anger down. We have to unconsciously keep telling ourselves not to feel this, right? So
Yeah,
you
right.
could, I'll be telling myself, don't feel this, don't feel this. So allow, meaning to push everything down. Only allow things that wants to come up. I've had these commands that runs all the way along my life. Spiritual commands to keep my anger down, like, nobody here, just allow, abide, 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 abide. It felt like I was abiding, but it was a command to keep my energy down so that I could actually soothe myself. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So
That's big. I mean, that's really big. I hope people heard that. There's so much we can say about first dimension if we could just slow everything down for everyone and talk about this because just the pleasure pain principle alone is if I'm sitting here as awareness and something comes up, remembering from the dimensional map that the thing that's coming up, we just gave some examples, shadow, craving, something is being created by what's under the water, what's buried. So we're sitting there and we can't feel what's under the water. That never arises.
exactly.
So we're sitting there and yeah, and we have this experience of that we're this awareness, and then what's coming up is just something that's safe enough for us to experience. That's all that it is from the unconscious level. It's not the core of our suffering, it's the effect of it, it's the visible effect. So then we allow it, and it can really train us to bypass because, like he's saying, it's because when you let something go and it feels peaceful and expansive, that conditions you to keep doing that. And so then you'll come back to just allowing. So then, but you don't understand that, like he's saying, at the unconscious level, the allow has with it hold back the anger. And that's the thing we
Yeah.
people can't hear because you weren't hearing that in meditation, right? You learned this later
No,
through repression and create. Yeah. Can you talk a
I
little bit
wasn't
more?
hearing
And I
anything.
want,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Finish.
Yeah, I was absolutely blind to all of it. I just it felt like I was just, yeah, a bliss to a point sometimes. I'll make sure I express that too. And I also want to just mention, it's like, if Toshi 10 years ago listening to us now talking, it's like, oh, they don't know what it's like. They just identify things, they just like, keep identifying that things. But trust me, I would say that, and then, but no identifying something is identification too, you know? So that's what I was doing. Like, don't identify, don't, something will rise. Maybe uncomfortable feelings might come. Maybe a sense of, the fear will come. But it's like, no, don't identify with that thought. Don't identify with thoughts. But that's an identification to not to identify with it, which I didn't spot at the time. So, if someone has to not identify, you identify with it, you see. And that's so easy to miss that if you're in a non-dual path here, to say, oh, these people identified, or I'm not identifying. Like you try and not identify with something, but that is the biggest identification you can do to reinforce the fact that there's nothing to identify. You feed it even more. And then it's, oh yeah, okay, I'm not identifying, I'm not identifying with this, I'm not identifying with this. Like you push down more and more, but you have to push them down. You don't see that, what Scott was saying, you don't see that push down movement because all you're seeing on the surface level is I'm not identified with it. And it's so confusing because it just feels true. Because every time you do it, the pressure comes, like, you get in your knees bit. But then the pain comes afterwards. But we can get to that in a minute. But yeah, so
Well,
yeah.
I think I just kind of want to leave it here as the last few moments of this because we can also include second dimension inquiry in seeking. But if you think
Mm,
about what we're saying, like there's a pleasure pain principle involved here in most everything we're doing when we have repression. So, like, we could go into so many different practices and pointers. This is why we created the map, is to invite you to see it. But basically, as long as we have repression, what we're doing at the surface is there to keep us safe from the repression. But what we'll do is we'll tell ourselves other things in order to stay safe. So when we're sitting there allowing everything, we will be taught or we will believe that we're really getting to the root of it or somehow that this is getting to the end of it or whatever. But the whole time we have the repression underneath saying, no, you're not going to feel this. This will not come up. And then here comes more suffering. And so the
yeah.
seeking, I think a big part of it is just not seeing what you think, Toshi, not seeing how the suffering arises, and then also how the seeking arises. I mean, this is, or even how the bypassing arises because it comes from the same source under the water. What would you say to seekers since we're on this subject? I mean, I know what I would say, and I'm going to say it after you, who don't know that the seeking itself, in other words, whatever we're trying to do to get to a state or to feel better, get rid of things, that the seeking itself, when you have repression, is part of the suffering. It comes from repression and it helps us avoid. It just helps us stay safe from what we've buried. What would you say about just generally seeking what you've learned in your experience about it?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak from my experience, but if I go back to that time, I mean, it's hard to remember nowadays, it's weirdly, but I think I was actually measuring success, measuring what's right or wrong, or what's true or not true by how I was feeling. So, if I feel like I resonate with a certain teaching or teacher, it's like, yeah, I understand why I really resonate with this teacher. But if I really check, I wish I could tell myself, just check your body. What are you getting from when you hear this thing? Is this soothingness? It's just not scariness, not this, not non-sufferingness, I could say. But the suffering gets so subtle because it just becomes normal when we repress my emotions as we grow up. You don't know you're suffering, you see. But when the suffering goes away a little bit temporary, that's when we get the nervous system will calm down. So we kind of start to measure success of our life or what's true or what's not true by that. And that's what I was almost chasing. So, if you can just tune into why certain things resonate you or why certain, you know, if what is it that we're actually getting? I know it's difficult to know at the time. I don't know, I'll probably dismissed it. So maybe I had to suffer too. So, but what would I say to myself back then? What would I say to those people seeking? I mean, keep keep seeking, but you can be aware because within that movement of seeking, that's where you want to look into. So we're not saying just like dismiss that seeking. Within that movement of wanting to this, Scott, tell me what I need to hear. All this thing. That's the answer. That's where the suffering is really, because suffering is not when you feel bad. Suffering is both when you feel good and bad. That follows that continuation of unconsciousness. So just see, am I unconscious? What am I telling myself right now that I'm unconscious of things? I wish I knew how to even do that kind of little, not a deep inquiry, but just start to questioning why am I seeing or saying or wanting these certain things in certain situations, really. So yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
would say. Yeah,
Or
yeah.
we could even invite people. We're not really showing people how to do inquiry, but publicly, not here we aren't. But
Mm,
one inquiry that I do publicly with people is just like if you're seeking something, just go into your body and say, what do I get out of seeking? And then just journal
mm,
it and write it down and learn some things there. But okay, so I have so much that I want to say from just what Toshi said. I'll say a few things. I totally agree that we capitalize on the seeking. So I hope that nothing I said was to vilify seeking, because we can't help it. It just comes up.
Mm.
But here, people have already done repression inquiry. The embodiment process can say to you when you first get here, even if you're not conscious of it, here's where that's connected. It's connected to the repressed emotions, the frozen fear under the water. And then we'll show you how to see it. It's a mind body connection. The seeking, you get safety out of it. I'll just show you. You'll eventually see it keeps us safe and gets us love and approval. Because by seeking, that's the time, that's our ego consciousness. And people know this, but they don't often know that it's connected to what's under the water. That's the point here. And so we have to show it to you. You have to see it in your own experience. But if I can just leave you with this, and I'll ask Toshi to leave us with a few thoughts. How I want people to leave this workshop on seeking is this. If you can understand this basic thing, Donald Hoffman is an evolutionary theorist who has done a thought experiment that basically says between thought choice A and B, we always choose A, regardless of what we think. So A is survival and safety. B is reality as it really is. So they studied evolution to see how are we surviving? Are we really seeing things as they are? And of course, they found out we're not, and that we're only seeing what we need to see. We're only seeing our own conditioning. And we're always choosing from that and choosing more of that because we survive that way. So we get pleasure essentially out of our suffering from a buried emotion standpoint. And that's what Toshi was saying. It's like, it's not just feeling bad, it's the whole cycle of pleasure, pain. So that if we keep seeking or using methods that just give us temporary feel good, then we're actually training our system. It teaches our system, kick in more suffering. That works. All of that. The stories and identities work to keep you safe and surviving as a separate self. And then your bypassing method, which doesn't get to the buried emotions, keeps you safe as that separate self because you don't get to the root of it. That's why suffering keeps going. So here, what would you say, Toshi, other than what I said, is we want to show people from the beginning what we're talking about in their own body instead of just believing us or this being just another pointer that people hear.
Yeah, yeah, I just make it short because we run out of time. But yeah, I just want to say that it's a real shame because what non-dual pointing and spirituality in general points to is absolutely amazing, and we're not denying any of those things, right or wrong or anything like that. But it's how we or I had to use it to cope. It's just like I could say it's just same as having a glass of wine to soothe myself. You could say there's no absolutely no difference from the program's point of view. That's still seeking to so that I can feel okay. And even huge pointers like this, non-dual stuff, we could completely miss the whole thing because we get in our needs met. And that's how costly it can be. And where is that thing that we keep push down going? In our body. Body keeps a score. So it's no joke for some of us. It's a real, it's not just about, okay, I won't be enlightened, or I won't know this. No. We can really get really ill or depressed, or all these consequences of holding ourselves back to be who we really are. There is a consequence. And I don't want to scare people or anything like that. But so um it's a real shame, and I hate for people to miss the real point is the non-duality and all of that because you're just using it to just soothe ourselves to be okay temporarily, basically. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
Toshi. And I want to invite everybody to just keep watching the series because segment number 2 is about finding, and we're kind of getting to that subject already, is that if you do these practices, what can you expect, even if you have a shift or an experience? So stay tuned. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.